Hello and welcome to UKEdChat After Hours. Thank you for joining us. This week we are talking about what happens after the summer holiday, and that's not even here yet. Talking about all of the preparations that we're hoping to make over the summer holidays to get ready, and also how to close that gap which inevitably happens over the summer holidays. And because this has been such a big, I wouldn't call it holiday, but a big break away from school, we are expecting some regression in learning skills, possibly behavior and habits which go along with schools. So I'm Martin. You can find out more about me on Twitter by going to ICT Magic and find out what I'm doing there. So I'm one of the little helpers behind the scenes at UKEdChat. I'm also a primary school teacher. So my focus for this conversation is going to be very much on the primary basis. If you'd like to comment or even join the discussion, then if you're watching live, you can do so. There is a chat panel at the side of your screen. If you're watching the archive version, then you can still join in the conversation by making comments wherever you find this. So we're going to move straight on. And Matt, hello.
Hello there.
Could you introduce yourself, please? Where can people find you on Twitter? And who are you and what do you do in schools?
My name is Matt Walby. I am a deputy head of EBAC faculty in a secondary school in Runcorn in northwest England. I'm a head of history by sort of stock in trade, and I'm on Twitter at Matt Walby, MattWalby.
Okay, super. And any of the links that we talk about within this, we will share on the show notes. So that's the only link you need to know, and we'll share that wherever you find this. So we're talking about the gap now. In the chat we've just had on Twitter, dispute that there is a gap at all, and if there is one, then that's because we're focusing squarely on exams, and it's the gap between where students are now and where they need to be for an exam. How do you feel about that particular focus? Do you feel like there is a gap in learning which happens over holidays such as the school holidays in the UK?
I think there's always a gap in terms of the 6-week summer break. I think every year that I've been teaching, and I've been teaching for 20 odd years now, you always see students that, fall back, that the progress is not what it should be really, given that 6-week break. And obviously, as you said at the start of the presentation tonight, the huge amount of time that some students have been out of learning is going to cause big issues. I mean, obviously lots of schools, I'm sure, are involved in remote learning in one form or another. But there are key issues there with engagement from students in terms of whether they're taking part in those lessons, if they're even able to take part in lessons because they haven't got the tech at home or the internet access at home to be able to sort of take part in those. So there are going to be some huge gaps in both skills and knowledge, certainly across Key Stage 3 from year 6 into year 7, and obviously from year 10 into year 11 coming up, from September.
And do you think that there is going to be a disparity between gaps of students in your class? As you said, there's going to be different levels of technology at home. Do you think that's caused maybe a barrier between those who have been able to access the curriculum that your school's provided and further afield across the entire country? Some schools have been, I don't want to say proactive, but they've offered more interactivity when it comes to their offering for students, where others have been moving much more down the independent learning route of providing resources that way. So do you think that there's going to be quite a disparity within your own students and across the national picture as well?
I think positive experience is a really key issue at the moment in terms of education across all key stages. Certainly going into Key Stage 4 for my students as a historian, obviously we're all, we're waiting with bated breath for the Ofqual announcement that actually came out today. And in terms of their proposals in history and geography that I know of in a bit of detail, the fact they're offering options where you can choose certain components of the course you can let into students in the exam for, I think is a major step forward, because obviously with a 2-year GCSE course, there's no set guidance in terms of what you teach in what particular order. So there'll be some schools that have done some parts of the course and others done other parts of the course. That's obviously a really important step forward. In terms of coming into Key Stage 3 from year 6 into year 7, again, there are big issues there because we simply don't really know what do students do in history, for example, in Key Stage 2 at different times. I know, for example, that some students will do the Mayans maybe in year 6, some might do it in year 5 or year 4. And that's very difficult for us because, we're trying to look at what kind of intervention and gap packs and recovery curriculum we can put into place for students. But at the same time, we've got to be cautious of the fact there's no good us saying, so we're going to look at the Mayans today because you might have missed that in primary school. And half the class is going, great, this is all new to me. And half the class is saying, well, we did this in year 5, so this is boring for us. So there are obviously major concerns there. And I think for a lot of schools, there's going to be a big focus on skills more than content. I think some with knowledge that's, not been able to be taught in Key Stage 2, sadly might just not be taught very much in Key Stage 3, whereas there's a focus on the skills, I think, and applying the new knowledge they're going to be getting will be the way forward. But it's very difficult. It's a very mixed picture, I'm sure, across the whole country.
So do you think that there's an increased focus on what feeder schools and the kind of communication that happens between primary schools and secondary schools and any kind of transition that's going on? Do you think there's a much bigger, or should be a much bigger focus on that for this particular event? Because there has been obviously a great disruption between what has gone before and now. I mean, the entire landscape of teaching has changed overnight. And obviously you need to know what students have learned and what they haven't learned and what kind of situation they've been learning it in over the last couple of months. So can I ask you, has there been any inkling of what kind of communication there's going to be between your feeder schools and your own school, and how you're going to address some of the possible gaps in your own classroom? You've already alluded to some of them.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's where you've got feeder schools where the vast majority of year 6 go to the same local school almost. That thing is quite a strong position to be in because, you really you'll have a clear understanding of, what the gaps might be from year 6 for those particular students. Where you've got a disparate number of schools that send students to your secondary school in year 7, it's absolutely key that, pastoral staff in the sort of year 7 transition team must be working closely with primary schools to ascertain, what kind of curriculum do you follow in year 6 and where do you think the gaps are? And this is quite a funny one because I've talked to the head of maths at my school earlier this week about the same issue. And he was saying to me that in some ways, the fact that certain topics in year 6 might not have been taught could be a blessing for him because he sometimes has to spend time unpicking errors in sort of methodologies that come through from year 6 into year 7. So for him, it's a sort of double-edged sword almost. It's a bit of a blessing and a bit of a curse at the same time. But yes, certainly communication, from Key Stage 2 into Key Stage 3 is it's always important, I think. But this year, absolutely vital.
Yeah, it's not just a transition between Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. Every stage you have to unlearn something which hasn't been explained to the fullest extent, or it was simplified for a good reason. But it's certainly you're quite right, and that's something which happens all the way through primary school as well. But that's an interesting observation. So, is it realistic to expect us to hit the ground running and provide a full curriculum and to accelerate learning to fill this gap, or should we just accept this gap and do the best we possibly can? Are we going to be firefighting when we return to school? Is it just something that we're going to have to live with? Because obviously, if we've taken that time out of the classroom, all of that for pretty much half a school year, can we realistically expect to catch up that amount?
I think there are so many important issues to be sort of thinking about. I mean, obviously, there's been talk of increased focus on the core subjects in year 7 from September onwards, and maybe not doing certain subjects in the foundation stage for 2 terms in year 7. But then, of course, that creates a gap in itself because if you're not teaching for example, you're not teaching Spanish for 2 terms in year 7, you would otherwise be normally doing, that then becomes a gap down the line you've got to fill somewhere else. So there are major concerns there. There are concerns, for example, about teacher training. If we're not teaching history as much in year 7, for example, next year, and we've got student teachers coming into our school from the universities, we've got to ensure they're getting a diet that's going to enable them to be, qualified and experienced within the year they've got to train to be secondary school teachers. For me personally, my sort of standpoint is, well, look, I'm an historian by stock in trade, and therefore I would say to people, look, how can history support literacy? How can we make sure that we are using our curriculum time to develop literacy and to an extent numeracy as well within those subjects, and look at how we can support that? And I think there's lots of work going on, certainly in my school, with literacy and numeracy, looking at how can we make that more cross-curricular, which of course is sort of a national trend anyway, but I think the even bigger focus coming up this year. One thing that has been talked about, of course, is PE in secondary schools, and there's major problems there with PE in terms of changing rooms and how you're going to sort of supervise that and what sports you can and can't play. So whether or not it's a possibility that maybe some students spend a bit less time in year 7 doing PE and use that sort of curriculum time for some sort of intervention catch up, that's been mooted, I've seen on social media. So, but of course, the problem is that we're all a little bit in the dark. Every day a new announcement sort of comes out, or there's a new rumor that comes out, and we are trying to, in some ways, have plan A, plan B, plan C, and plan D, and then see what comes out with all the latest announcements.
Okay, so you say there's not a lot of clarity at the moment for this. What maybe one piece of guidance would you like from the government or maybe the leadership of your school, which would help you as an individual history teacher to perform your job better in the current situation?
I think it's got to be an understanding of flexibility in some ways, and that one plan is not going to fit every school in the country. If the government announces we are going to do X, Y, and Z, well, okay. And then within that, if we can do X, Y, and Z in our school, we'll do that. And if we can do X and Y, and we'll attempt to do Z to the best of our ability, given our building size or cohort size or the building layout, that's something to be aware of, I think. You just can't have this one-size-fits-all approach. And then talk about penalising schools if they're not following it. Obviously, there's talk of no Ofsted inspections until December at least, which obviously is a welcoming thing. But they're still talking about potentially fining parents who don't send their children in September, which I don't think really is the best approach at this given time. I think some flexibility and understanding would be key there. For me, as a classroom practitioner, I think it's just, again, it's a realization that there are going to be gaps and that is going to impinge on progress and just an understanding of that. And it's going to take a little bit of time to plug those gaps and to close those gaps. And we've got to be given the opportunity to do so. It's no good just taking our curriculum time away to plug gaps elsewhere, because as I mentioned earlier, it just becomes a big gap that I've got to try and fill.
Mm. So moving on to more of the pastoral side of things, and also linking to the idea of maybe some pupils will not wish to attend school in September for various reasons around the coronavirus. What do you see changing in schools to maybe prevent some of the anxiety which may be around the coronavirus from what's happened at the moment? So possibly some social and mental health issues which have arisen because of the isolation of the pandemic, but also some of the quite extreme measures that schools are taking to keep pupils apart. So what can schools do to hopefully help possible anxiety when it comes to that sort of thing within their own schools?
Well, I think what saddened me is in all the statements I've seen from the government over the last week or so, there's been no real mention at all of mental health as an issue for young people. And I think it's going to be a huge issue across all key stages. I'm sure it'll be the same in primary school, trying to get children to adjust to being back in primary school and trying to explain to reception children that you can't hug your friends and you can't give your teacher a hug, because that's what they do naturally at that age, I'm sure. I've got children who are starting reception in September, and it's going to be difficult for them. They can't take their favourite toy into shape because they're not allowed to. And that is going to impact on mental health. And I really think that schools have got to be given the resources and the time to be able to almost have, little one-to-one meetings with students over those first, 2, 3, 4 weeks, just to kind of touch base and just, reconnect with students and just make sure, how are things? How have you got on over the last 6 weeks being at home for all that time? How have you found the work? Have you been able to engage? And just what are your concerns and your worries? What's on your mind? And then what can we do as schools to support young people in that situation? And that's got to be, I think, something that schools should be looking at. But of course, I appreciate that, heads of year are very, very busy. A lot of heads of year still have full teaching commitments as well. So it's about, finding the time and finding the resources to enable that to take place.
So how do you see the first days and weeks of school panning out? What kind of activities do you think will happen, and what activities do you think that usually happen won't be happening? So, for example, the whole school assembly, which is a bit of a tradition at most primary schools, and I'm sure secondary schools for the first couple of days back, won't be happening. But perhaps something like a tour of the school in its new format, which I'm sure is going to be barriered and socially distanced in various ways. So what kind of activities and regimes do you think are going to be put in place and carried out within the first days or weeks at school?
Well, as you mentioned, a big thing with returning students is always the whole school assembly and the year group assembly, and then for the year 7 to tour around the building and where are the science labs and where are the DT workshops and where are the art rooms and everything else, and that could be off limits because it looks like certain parts of a building will be bubbled for certain year groups, and therefore the students stay in that kind of zone, and the teacher moves to them. As I understand it, we've been given a trolley from September onwards so that we can sort of hawk our wares around the building, and we go to the students rather than them coming to us. But again, there's implications there for lessons like DT and science, because I can teach history. Give me some desks and some pens and paper, and I'm good to go. But you can't get the Bunsen burners out in my classroom, for example. So there are major problems there with looking at curriculum and how you design the curriculum. In terms of routines, there's going to be so much basic stuff about hand washing and cleanliness and not touching and social distancing, and really reinforcing those rules, explaining how the routines are going to work in terms of lunch times and break times and where you can and can't go. And that's going to take a lot of time for the students to get used to, and for the staff as well, because we've got to realise, if we've been bubbled with the year 10, then we can't go ambling off towards the year 7 area. But then again, of course, you have to wonder, once the students are out of the building and they're all in the local park together, mixing together, it's a bit of a waste of time, almost, all that effort. So I don't know, but certainly routines and expectations, and hopefully spending some time with the students, I think, on a little one-to-one basis, pastoral time will be absolutely key.
I like the idea of a trolley. I immediately came to my mind a drinks trolley, and that would probably...
I was thinking dessert, but you can tell where your mind's going.
Yeah. It probably helped with my next question, which is about how teachers can be at the top of their game. Well, there's the answer. But in these troubled pandemic times, obviously I've been away from school for a long time. Many been behind a camera and not been interacting with other teachers. How can teachers be at the top of the game for that first rush at the outset of school in September?
I think it's going to be very difficult, isn't it? I think teachers are not used to the way they've been working in the last, 4 or 5 months. I think that some sort of remote learning will have to continue in some form in schools, because, for example, you might have 32 children in a class and your room can't take more than 16 due to the size of the room and that they're keeping 2 meters apart. So it may well be that you could have children with you, maybe 15, 16, and then 15 or 16 sat next door with a different member of staff or a member of SLT or TA or somebody, and you are teaching through your device again whilst they listen and take part. But we're all in the planning stage. Once we've found out this week that we're going to be going back for sure in September and everyone's going to be there, it does come down to, right, okay, what are the logistics then of teaching and ensuring some sort of decent outcomes for those students at the end of the year? And there's going to be a big push on year 10 into year 11. I would imagine in primary school, I'm assuming that SATs are going to be taking place in year 6 next year. I don't know.
Nobody knows at this point.
Well, I'd say at least for secondary schools, we've had some sort of guidance today in terms of exams from Ofqual for 2021. I imagine you guys in Key Stage 2 are now waiting for a similar thing in terms of what's happening in year 6 in September for next year.